Today we are learning about common sentence errors, and hopefully this will be a useful exercise to you, especially with your writing. I do see some of these errors in your essays that I've graded so far this session. So the first thing we're going to discuss is fragments. And a fragment is a group of words that is punctuated as a sentence, but is not grammatically complete. So we've talked about sentence structures, and what makes a sentence complete is that it contains a subject and a verb, that it can stand alone as an independent clause. So a few ways that you can create a fragment just so you understand the kind of the science behind why we call it a fragment. First of all, if a group of words is missing a subject or a verb, then it cannot be a complete sentence because those are pretty integral elements. So let me give you a couple examples. The company had a solid plan, including putting more people to work. Now I gave you two sentences here because usually fragments happen in the context of your writing. So they happen as you're talking along, writing your paragraph, and you don't notice that this one sentence is incomplete. So as you look at these two sentences, this example, I want you to try and identify in your mind which one is the fragment. The company had a solid plan, including putting more people to work. The second sentence is the fragment, including putting more people to work. It's actually missing a subject. Who is including putting more people to work? What? There is a plan including putting more people to work. So that second sentence is the fragment. Another example. I remember my teacher, Miss Sanders, a lady who loved math. And again, in this example, the second sentence, a lady who loved math, what? There's no verb. It's incomplete. So those are just some examples of the common types of fragments that I see in essays. Also, a fragment can be formed by a dependent clause that is not connected to an independent clause. And we've already talked about independent versus dependent clauses a little bit. A dependent clause typically starts with a subordinating conjunction like although or because or even though, while, words like that. So in this example, although he gave her flowers, she broke up with him anyway. So that first sentence is actually the culprit here. That is a fragment. Although he gave her flowers, what? There needs to be more to the sentence. And the easiest way to correct this one would actually be to put a comma after the word flowers and then just connect that dependent clause to the independent clause, the second sentence. Then you would have one complete sentence. So a dependent clause cannot stand alone. It needs to be connected to an independent clause or it becomes a fragment. I believe fragments are pretty easy to identify because you can usually hear them. Your ear is a pretty reliable source here as you're looking at examples as to whether or not it just sounds complete. So most students do pretty well with identifying fragments on tests and quizzes and such. The next common sentence error we are going to discuss is a fused sentence, and you may have learned this in high school, heard it called a run-on sentence, and it's the same thing. So however you want to think of it. Your textbook calls it a fused sentence, so that's the term we use on our quizzes and tests. And a fused sentence is an error in which two sentences run together without punctuation. So something like this. It has been raining all morning. I wish it would stop. So as you read that, I hope you can notice that there should be a period or a semicolon or something after the word morning. It has been raining all morning. I wish it would stop. Those are two separate ideas. You need punctuation to join those two clauses, those two independent clauses. So let's talk about the different ways you can correct a fused sentence. There are a couple different options. Here, it has been corrected by the use of a comma and a conjunction. It has been raining all morning, comma, and I wish it would stop. That is one appropriate way that you can join two independent clauses. Here we have the use of the semicolon, and we're going to learn more about semicolons this week, but you can go ahead and start tucking this away in your brain, that a semicolon can be used to join independent clauses. A semicolon functions that way very similarly to, you can put a period between independent clauses, but of course a period creates two separate sentences, while a semicolon joins those clauses together into one sentence. And that is the final way you can correct a run-on, is to just use a period and create two separate sentences. So it just depends. If you find a run-on sentence, a few sentences in your writing, then you have different options as to how you're going to correct it. But this kind of proofreading takes a lot of work as you're looking at your essays, examining every single sentence and making sure that it's complete, it's not fused, and finally, the final sentence error that we're going to discuss, that you're not using a comma splice. Now, we talk about comma splices separately from commas just because this is such a big deal and it's such a common error that, in fact, it's probably one of the more common errors that I mark in sentences on student essays. So let's talk about what a comma splice is. A comma splice is a sentence error in which two independent clauses are incorrectly joined by a comma. So here's the thing about commas, and hopefully you've already looked at the handout and watched the video about all the different comma rules, and we'll be reminded of a few of those today as we discuss this. But one thing to remember is that a comma cannot be used like a period, all right? And so a little helpful hint that I always give my students is never use a comma where you could use a period. They are not interchangeable marks of punctuation. So if you could put a period between those independent clauses and create two separate sentences, well, that's essentially what a comma splice is. So let me give you some examples, or an example. Susan loves visiting the zoo. Her favorite animal is the giraffe. So if you look at my little italicized rule there, could we put a period between those independent clauses? Yes, we could. Susan loves visiting the zoo, period. Her favorite animal is the giraffe. So it is incorrect for me to use that comma there. That is called a comma splice. In fact, a comma splice is really just a different version of a fused sentence. You're just using the wrong mark of punctuation. Instead of running two sentences together without any punctuation, you're incorrectly joining them with a comma. So the rules for correcting this type of error are the same. So the same here if you add a conjunction, and that is the correct way to use a comma to join independent clauses is a comma and a conjunction. So these are typically going to be your coordinating conjunctions like and, but, so, for, yet, but you have to have that conjunction. The comma is not strong enough to pull those independent clauses together on its own. You have to have a comma and a conjunction. Now, if you don't want to use the conjunction, you can use the semicolon. As I mentioned before, a semicolon is strong enough to join independent clauses. So if you don't want two short, choppy sentences, you can just use the semicolon, and then you have a complete sentence, two independent clauses joined together. And then finally, you can use a period, just as in correcting the fused sentences. So all these methods are the same, but I just wanted you to see multiple examples here. Now, I do have a few more reminders as far as commas, because sometimes what happens is students learn about comma splices and they say, okay, well, I don't want to get points off for comma splices, so I'm just going to stop using commas. I just won't use commas anymore, or I'll just always use semicolons. And that's not really a great solution to the problem. You need to understand the rules about when to use commas, when to use semicolons, how they work. So one thing to remember is that you may use a comma to join a dependent and independent clause, okay? So a sentence like this, even though I was very hungry, I couldn't decide what to eat. So that is actually correct, because the first clause there, even though I was hungry, that's a dependent clause. So I can join that to the independent clause with just a comma. And do you remember my rule? Never use a comma where you could use a period. Could I put a period after this word hungry? Even though I was very hungry, period. I couldn't decide what to eat. Well, that wouldn't work, because then the first half of the sentence would become a fragment. And so to me, that's helpful. That's what helps you identify a comma splice, is if you could just put a period there and have two separate sentences, well then you know that's the wrong use of a comma. If you couldn't put a period there because one of those clauses is dependent, then you know it's okay to use that comma. So if I took out the subordinating clause, I was very hungry, I couldn't decide what to eat. That's what would make it a comma splice, is if they were both independent clauses. I hope that makes sense. And again, sometimes people get a little gun shy with commas and they just start leaving them out. And it is actually a rule. You must use a comma with a conjunction that joins independent clauses. So if I have a sentence like this, pizza sounds pretty good, but I might prefer a hamburger and fries, you have to have that comma, and then the conjunction but. If you leave the comma out, well then I'm going to, count it as a comma error on your paper. So that would actually be incorrect to leave the comma out. The comma and the conjunction work together to join independent clauses. So don't just say, oh, well, if I use commas, I might have a comma splice, so I'm just not going to use them anymore. Don't do that. You really just have to work on learning the rules. Okay, and then I did have a few other examples here, just a little practice here at the end of the video. And this is very similar to what it's going to look like on a quiz and a test, where you're given, here's a sentence. Is it a comma splice? Is it a run-on? Is it a fragment? Or is it correct? And so kind of that multiple choice type option. So like this sentence right here. Because I got my paycheck, I plan to go shopping for a new pair of jeans. My old ones are torn. Okay, what do you think? Is it a comma splice? There's a comma there. Is it a fragment? Is it a fused sentence? Or is it correct? This is actually a fused sentence. And the first half of the sentence, like that comma is fine. Because I got my paycheck, I plan to go shopping for a new pair of jeans. And that's where the period should go. My old ones are torn. That's where you could put a period and have two separate sentences, is after the word jeans. Okay, another one. Red-haired people, the ones who struggle with keeping their tempers in tense situations. Now this one, to me, when I say it out loud, I can hear it. Red-haired people, the ones who struggle with keeping their tempers in tense situations. What? This is a fragment. It's missing a verb. The subject of the sentence is red-haired people, and there's no actual verb there to complete the sentence. So it doesn't have to be a short sentence to be a fragment. You can have longer sentences that are fragments. Okay, dinners by candlelight are nice, but I forgot to buy matches. So just think to yourself, is it a comma splice? Is it a fused sentence? Is it a fragment? Or is it correct? And this one is correct. We have two independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction. So comma after the word nice, the conjunction but, so that is correct. Final example, Dinah got her braces tightened today. She is in some pain. Remember our rule about comma splices. Could I put a period there? Dinah got her braces tightened today, period. She is in some pain. Yes, I could. I could have put a period there and have two separate sentences, so that means that comma is not being used correctly, and it is indeed a comma splice. So like I said, this is very similar to what it's going to look like on your quiz for this week and on the final exam or your test. These show up on test 2. So just do the practice quizzes, and take the practice test, and hopefully you'll get good at identifying these.